So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Privacy and Trust in the mDL Ecosystem. A look at the underlying principles of privacy and trust that will be essential elements of the mobile driver's license ecosystem. Hello, my name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Technology Alliance. And this is a third in a series of 4 webinars that we've planned on this topic over the past few months and will be concluding next month in October. Today's webinar is being recorded and it will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. Also, there'll be time at the end for questions, so we encourage our listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on WebEx on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A and encourage you to submit questions while the speakers are presenting so that we have time to review those questions and organize them in advance so we can get to as many of those questions as we'll have time for. Also, there's going to be a short online knowledge assessment quiz available after the webinar. Participants who have attended all 4 webinars and completed the assessments will receive a certificate of participation and a discounted registration to any future Alliance paid conference or educational events. If we go to the next slide, please. So I'll be handling the introductions today of the webinar content and our panelists today. And prior to the start of the webinar, I'd like to say a few words about the Secure Technology Alliance and this Identity Council initiative to raise awareness of and accelerate the adoption of mobile driver's licenses in the United States. So if we go to the next slide, for those of you who are not familiar with the Secure Technology Alliance, here's a brief overview. The Secure Technology Alliance is a not-for-profit, multi-industry association working to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of security solutions. And we provide in a collaborative, member-driven environment educational and information resources about how smart cards, embedded chip technology, and related hardware and software can be adopted across all markets in the United States. Now, that's a pretty broad mission, but if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see that the principal markets and services we focus these activity towards, many of these industry verticals, such as access control, authentication, identity management, and mobile, et cetera, are where applications of mobile driver's license technology will play an important role in the future. And so as a cross-industry, member-supported organization, we do the following things to educate and stimulate the market by bringing together stakeholders to effectively collaborate on promoting secure solutions technologies and addressing the industry challenges for adoption. We do that through publishing white papers, doing webinars like today, putting on workshops, producing newsletters and position documents, and adding additional content to our web resources. We also run conferences and events that focus on these specific markets and technologies. We offer education programs, training, and industry certifications to advance people's professional careers, and provide networking opportunities for professionals to share ideas and knowledge about their field. And we produce strong industry communications through our public relations and web resources and social media to communicate that information to the greater public. We go to the next slide. So to narrow the focus around the broader market focuses of the Secure Technology Alliance, the Alliance forms working committees that organize into specific industry and technology verticals to address the specific ways that consumer interactions are made secure around common requirements. The Identity Council, which is leading this discussion, serves as a focal point for the Alliance's identity and identity-related efforts, leveraging embedded chip technology and privacy and security-enhancing software, and supporting a spectrum of physical and logical use cases and applications, different types of form factors and attributes, and authentication and authorization methods. Now, some of the specific areas that the Identity Council has provided thought leadership on are done through white papers, FAQs, webinars, and conference events, and some of those resources are listed, on the right side of the screen here. All of those resources are publicly available and accessed through our website. And as you can see, the mobile driver's license and ecosystem has a whole sub-block of information available that we've produced prior to this event and will continue to be adding to over the course of time. We can go to the next slide. So under the direction of the Identity Council, the Mobile Driver's License Initiative has grown in member engagement and importance for the betterment of digital identification and use of mobile technologies to address market needs in a number of different usage models. And this initiative is primarily industry-driven, it's education-focused, it is producing white papers and frequently asked questions documents, as well as a whole new set of online resources organized under a knowledge center that's searchable by topic type, mDL uses and explanations of how mobile driver's licenses will be used across different vertical markets, and even an interactive implementation map that shows the progress of mobile driver's license adoption across the United States. This website, mdlconnection.com, is a great way for people to learn how to get involved in this industry initiative and also work through the Secure Technology Alliance, the Identity Council, and the Mobile Driver's License team. We can go to the next slide, please. So with that introduction of the Alliance and the Identity Council, let me introduce our panelists for today's webinar. We'll start with Matt Thompson from IDEMIA and the Kantara Initiative, and he's the Senior Vice President of Civil Identity for North America. John Wunderlich is also with Kantara Initiative and is the Privacy and Security Advisor. Ted Sobel is the DHS Director of Risk and Resilience Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Christopher Williams is the Manager of Exponent's Statistical and Data Sciences Practice, where he focuses on solving emerging technology and policy problems in the areas of security, privacy, and data collection for commercial and public sector clients. And lastly, Arjan Geluk from UL is the lead principal advisor for identity management and security with UL and task force leader for the mDL standardization effort with ISO and a special technical advisor for mDL with AMVA organization. So if we can go to the next slide now, I'm going to hand things off to our first presenter, Matt Thompson from IDEMIA. Matt?
Hey, thanks, Randy. And good afternoon, audience. My name is Matt Thompson. I lead the Identity Solutions business here at IDEMIA and serve as the president of the board for Kantara. We want to welcome you, and we're excited that you're here with us today. In preparation for this webinar, the team you're going to hear from thought it'd be best for us to open with a brief, high-level vision statement about why we collectively believe mobile driver's license to have a very real and meaningful impact in improving privacy and trust, the very headline for today's session. You're going to hear from nationally and internationally respected industry experts on the details of the how we advance these foundational elements of privacy and trust. The work they're presenting today really represents a significant collective effort over the past decade by several government agencies, industry associations, and standard organizations. But we want to start by framing it up front in terms of the why. Kathy, if you'll advance to the next slide, please. We believe that the mobile driver's license really represents the future of identity in America and has the potential to significantly improve the quality of life and access to services for individuals, while also reducing the fraud and the friction that organizations experience today when needing to trust that an identity of a customer is valid and accurate. Securely enabling people's identity on their device and under their control is really the foundation of how we enable trust and choice in a modern world. If you'll click on trust in a mobile driver's license is really a multi-level opportunity that's tied to the trust in the underlying processes used by the motor vehicle agents to establish a person's identity, and then in the binding of that identity to the device, which is signed by the state. We're going to go into the details of those aspects later in the webinar, but the chain of trust is much stronger and much more auditable in a mobile driver's license than what we're accustomed to today with the physical driver's license. From an individual's perspective, the mobile driver's license promotes trust because the individual will have greater transparency and control in the exchange of their information and it'll be able to maintain a consent receipt that gives people a way of proving what they shared so that trust is reinforced through greater accountability in this future model. You may notice that we don't call out privacy explicitly in this vision statement. We believe that trust and privacy are relational. Simply, the less I trust you, the more privacy I will demand, and vice versa. And we believe that trust is earned through demonstrated consistency. When there's trust, it becomes an exchange and discussion around consent and value exchange. Providing a choice begins to establish the trust that we envision. Today, with a physical driver's license, the choice is really all or none when sharing our information, which leaves us constantly overexposing information. A widely used example of this to highlight the trade-off is when showing my driver's license to purchase alcohol. It's not necessary for the bartender to know my actual age, only that I'm over 21. And it's certainly not necessary for the bartender to know my home address or my weight. With mobile driver's license, we're able to minimize the data to just what is necessary for the transaction, making the data being requested easy for an individual to understand and giving them the choice and control of what they want to share. There's also another aspect of choice that a mobile driver's license provides that's superior to what we experience with the physical driver's license today, and that's really the choice of the channel through which an individual wants to engage or through which businesses or government agencies want to engage. Today, your physical driver's license is really difficult to use in a digital context, and in a post-COVID world where digital is no longer a nice to have, but a necessary in order to maintain the services that we're responsible for delivering from a government perspective or maintaining customer relationships in a commercial context, we really need an identity solution that gives people a consistent way of asserting their identity across both in-person and online experiences and opens up new channels that we can engage and increases the value that we get from our state-issued driver's license today, which really leads to the last part of our vision statement, modern world. The future of identity needs to safely and securely enable individuals to engage in all sorts of transactions from a device in the palm of their hand. For our increasingly digital lives, we need an identity credential that's purpose-built to support transactions we want to engage in person, online, and in the future, those things that we have yet to imagine. Getting identity right is central to enabling digital transformation for so many industries and government services, which is why the promise of mobile driver's license is so exciting, as a better identity credential issued by your state motor vehicle agency could not only address concerns with security and fraud, but also improve privacy and enable all sorts of new transactions and trusted services to be offered to a broader group of Americans online. We really hope that this vision statement interests and inspires you to engage with us to help build the future of identity in America. This task is absolutely as daunting as it sounds, and it's going to take all of the stakeholders working together to make sure we get it right, maximize the value for all participants in the identity ecosystem. Each of us have a very important role to play, and we'll hope that you'll join us in building this future on this exciting journey. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John Wunderlich to discuss the privacy-enhancing features of the mobile driver's license. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matt, and welcome to all the attendees for version 2 of session 3. I'd like to start with an overview of the privacy lifecycle for the mDL ecosystem from a provider's point of view, to enable each provider to provide reasonable privacy assurances to individuals for the trust that Matt just talked about. So people will be familiar or will have seen this plan, do, check type architecture or continuous improvement lifecycle for privacy, and it provides a full lifecycle of privacy assurance. The design element is building mDL readers or mDL software for the context that they will be deployed to. Make sure that you avoid scope creep. The implementation process, put processes in place that deployed readers and mDLs functions as designed. Again, for audit and accountability, the ability for each mDL holder to receive a report on the reader or to issuing authorities so that you can have that kind of accountability. Managing incidents, well, we know that incidents will happen, breaches will happen, and most of the time, most people will forgive organizations or entities that have a breach, what's really determinative in the survivability is how you respond to the breach. So be prepared to learn from them. And finally, learn your lessons and improve your systems so that you can update your design architecture and implement improved processes. Next slide, please. So the architecture, both the ISO standard 8013-5 and the Secure Technology Alliance white paper on this will refer to privacy by design, which has 7 significant principles, which you see on the left of the slide. And the mDL architecture covers those off in a number of different ways that I'd like to talk about. First, a key element of privacy or data protection is to enable user choice. For technologists or policy people on the provider side, these is a matter of security, access control, and so forth and so on. But from the individual's point of view, privacy is really a matter of the ability to choose what information they disclose, to whom, and for what reason. So it's interesting that this architecture ensures that the person has autonomy and agency. Key privacy by design principles here are the default settings in a system that should be privacy protective options, and that privacy is embedded into the design. The mDL standard includes 3 things that I want to draw your attention to. One is that the transfer of data is initiated by the user. So that's a fundamental part of user choice. The data transfer model is a privacy by default model, and data minimization is followed throughout the life cycle. The key functional requirements vis-a-vis privacy is that the interface between the mDL and the mDL reader shall support the selective release of mDL data. Matt used the example of age verification at a drinking establishment. These days, if you're lucky enough to be in an area of the world that has them open. That's section 6.2 of the standard. Data exchange has 3 phases, starting with an initiation phase that appears to be always initiated by the mDL, which is a privacy positive control in the user's hands. That's 6.3.2.1 in the standard. So the data transfer model presumes user involvement. The transactions are initiated by the mDL holder. Data minimization is enabled in the model. And we talk about biometric templates to ensure that you're not actually storing biometrics in the system. Next slide, please. So how do you fulfill those design goals? The implementation, the challenges, rather I should say, how do you fulfill those design goals? The devil is, of course, in the implementation. Notwithstanding the privacy positive elements that are captured in the design of the mobile driving license ecosystem, jurisdiction implementations need to fulfill the promise of the architecture to deliver privacy and data protection in the context of that jurisdiction. So we talked about user initiation, minimum data transfers and secure transfers. What are the kinds of implementation controls that you can use to make sure that you deliver on those design implementations? One, making sure that your project staff understand the importance of non-functional requirements before go live. It's a leftover from the old days where as long as the system functions, the non-functional requirements can be taken care of later. When you're dealing with personal information like financial information, moving fast and breaking things isn't always the best option, because once you have a privacy breach, there is no putting that milk back in the carton. Making sure that you do assessments during the requirements of the design process, whether you call it a data protection impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment, those two relate to protection of privacy, or a threat risk assessment, or a pen test, or a vulnerability assessment related to security. Make sure that at the various stages of your project, when it's appropriate, if you have gates or checkpoints, that your privacy and security controls are at an adequate point for that point in the project. And finally, making sure that you've got metrics and reporting for the readers, for the holder, and for the regulators and the public. It's trite to say that you can't manage what you can't measure, but it's true. So if you're not, don't build in the metrics that enable you to demonstrate the trust that you're asking for, you're going to have a hard time. Next slide, please. So what's interesting to me when I look at this architecture for interoperability, or the high-level mDL architecture, is how similar it is to other things that are happening in the identity and verification space. If you look on the right, you'll see the issuer, holder, and verifier from verified credentials, which is a W3C. On the bottom right, you'll see the owner, holder, verifier, and issuer, which is from the notion of self-sovereign identity. And what this tells us is that there's a convergence in a high-level architecture, and that interoperability is going to be key. I'm reasonably certain, and I think participants in this call would agree, that as each jurisdiction provides an mDL in its jurisdiction, that will be one kind of verified credential or one kind of identity credential or token that most people are going to have on their devices. But that provides a high level of assurance from a government-issued authority that enables it to be used for other purposes, which creates an opportunity for innovation and market growth for manufacturers and distributors of readers, infrastructures, and the ability of issuing authorities to have dependable reliance on their tokens. So making that interoperable will be key. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up, how do you close the loop to make sure that what you deliver is what you've promised? Transparent operations. We've all heard what's the biggest lie on the internet. Yes, I have read and understood the terms and conditions, yada, yada, yada. So it's not enough to write policies. If you don't close the loop and show holders of mDL why they should continue to trust you, your system will be at risk come the first adverse headline. And this is my mantra when I deal with clients in all kinds of different contexts. If a user is surprised about how their data is being used, that's a privacy fail. And you can't say, well, they shouldn't be surprised because it was written in the privacy policy, because nobody reads privacy policies. It should be inherent and transparent in the operation of the system. So how do you provide that kind of transparency and audibility? Public summaries of PIAs or impact assessments, public summaries of breach reports are critical. If you try and hide that there have been breaches, that doesn't turn out well. Provide user portals or account management for users to be able to see how their data has been used. And as Matt talked about earlier, consider using consent receipts or some other record of transactions so that users have their own reference points to validate that you've done what you're doing. So when you close the loop on privacy, you're also closing the loop on trust to make sure that you build that trusted relationship with your stakeholders. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Ted. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great, thank you very much for that. Before we delve into how to be a smart mobile driver's license consumer, we must first start by thinking about how to be a smart identity consumer. And at the heart of that is identity proofing. Next slide, please. First, it is worth considering from whence identity comes and how reliable it is. In other words, how much confidence should the relying party have that the ID establishes the person is who he or she claims to be. This figure is a representation of the interdependencies among the person, the identity proofer, and the relying party. At the center of these relationships is an assessment of risk and impact. Basically, what are the consequences of error or fraud? And what is it worth to me as a relying party to minimize the chance of that happening? In some cases, the consequences are minimal, like issuing a discount card for a grocery store. So not a lot of time or resources need to be spent on identity proofing. At the other end of the spectrum, the consequences can be grave, like programs by the US government about determining who has access to classified information. That risk assessment should inform all elements of the identity ecosystem. Next slide, please. The 2018 ANSI NASCO standard on identity proofing lays out a four-step process for enrolling an identity. Relying parties can use this framework in deciding whether a type of ID is suitable for its purposes. Step one, the preliminary or design stage. This includes the risk assessment, which we just discussed, which then informs what information is collected and what procedures are used to look for error or fraud. Step two is assertion. The individual claims an identity, usually in the form of a combination of biographic data, perhaps tied to a biometric like a facial image. The identity provider resolves the claimed identity down to a unique individual. In other words, the process should prevent Ted Sobel from DHS from being confused with Ted Sobel, who is a professional weightlifter in California. The standard lays out combinations of biographical data that can be used to achieve a high degree of accuracy. For example, TSA primarily uses full name and date of birth to minimize misidentifications when vetting nearly 2 million air travelers per day. Step three is verification. Collect and review supporting evidence needed to link the claimed identity to the individual. Safeguards might include training employees to spot fraud, electronic verification of documents, checks against source records, forensics, etc. As a side note, the process in place that was put in place in step one should be there to support the verification. In other words, when you're designing the system and designing what data you collect, understand how you're going to be using it so you can collect once and not have to ask multiple times. Step four is determination. That's just a simple yes or no decision on whether the individual is who or she claims to be. If you understand how identity providers implement steps 1 through 3, you will know whether you can rely on the determination in step 4. Next slide, please. So a few words about driver's licenses. First, they are by far the most commonly used and accepted forms of IDs in the United States. Each state determines for itself the enrollment process used to issue the driver's licenses, so you can have some variations. Enrollment processes and cards continue to evolve and get enhanced, that there are generations and cycles where they're constantly incorporating best practices and lessons learned. The American Association for Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA, assists the states in this responsibility through publishing guidelines and providing training and promoting best practices. So what we have on this slide is a list of the requirements for Real ID. The Real ID Act of 2005 establishes voluntary minimum standards for the secure issuance and production of state-issued driver's licenses and non-driver IDs. It does not authorize the federal government the power to regulate driver's licenses. It does not create national databases. It does not create a national ID. Instead, it directs the Department of Homeland Security to establish what identity proofing is needed for the federal government to accept a driver's license for entering federal facilities and nuclear power plants, or for boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft. About 2/3 of Real ID concerns creating a baseline for secure identity proofing, such as what data helps establish identity, what documents can serve as evidence of that identity, which systems can be used to verify that identity in those documents. Are employees trained to spot fraud? Are safeguards in place to prevent insider threat? These requirements lead to a stronger identity, whether you are looking at cards or mobile driver's licenses. For relying parties, you'll need to know when you see a Real ID compliant card or a Real ID marked mobile driver's license, that you can be confident that the identity was proved at the federal government's baseline or above, without necessarily needing to know the details how each state handles proofing. Next slide, please. A word of caution, as we have now reached nationwide compliance with Real ID. Not all licenses that you will encounter will be Real ID compliant. Most states continue to offer their residents the option of getting a non-compliant card. The reason to get a non-compliant card may vary. It could be due to cost. It could be due to a person being unwilling or unable to prove lawful presence. It could be just a simple personal preference. Non-compliant cards will lack the Real ID star and include a statement similar to "not for federal identification." In the mDL world, a digital marker will be used to distinguish between a compliant and non-compliant mobile driver's license. So whether a physical card or a digital ID, it is up to the relying party to determine what to accept. I now turn you over to Chris to discuss how trust in issuance works digitally.
Thank you, Ted. So for relying parties accepting mDLs, it's a natural question to ask, well, what do I do? How do I know that my mDL or the person presenting the mDL is compliant with Real ID or it's even trusted at all? And the natural answer might be to look for the gold star compliance mark on the phone. Next slide, please. But we can say that this is absolutely and definitively wrong. The phone should never be used as a flash pass because the phone screen and the information presented on it are not secure. Fake apps can easily be made to duplicate the appearance of legitimate mDL, and there's no way for the relying party to visually authenticate that the data being presented is accurate or true. Next slide. So in the case of mDL, the data has to be passed over a secure channel using a means of cryptography to protect the data being passed from the mobile device to relying party. And all of the data that is being passed will be cryptographically signed by its issuer. This includes things like full name, date of birth, the Real ID status, and even the image itself should all be cryptographically signed by a trusted issuer. Next slide. So once the relying party gets these data elements from the mDL holder, they can go through a process of verifying legitimacy of these data elements. The first step is to verify that the signatures are correct on all the data that's being checked, computing the hash, and verifying that the hash data is contained within a trusted and valid mobile security object, which has been signed by an issuer public key. And again, it's very important that as a relying party, you only accept data that's being generated and signed by issuers you trust. It's on the onus of the relying parties to know which states they're going to trust and which states they're not. Particularly for mDLs, in the early stages of the ecosystem, this will be very important. So I'll say that again, only accept data from issuers that you trust. And then finally, to verify that the person presenting the data to you is the rightful owner of that data, you need to verify that the issuer has a signed facial image that matches the person standing in front of you. This match can be done through a visual in-person comparison by comparing the photo that's been generated and signed by this issuing party with the holder that's standing there, or it could be done through a facial recognition algorithm, which does a match of the individual standing in front of you with the signed trusted image. One important point is that that image match should only be done using trusted hardware. In this case, hardware the relying party controls. It's important to remember that only images that the relying party captures or images that are signed by the issuer should be trusted. So with all of this data combined, the relying party is able to trust that the issuer generated the data and it belongs to the rightful holder. But that doesn't simply establish trust itself. And so I'm going to pass this on to Arjan to discuss how trust is established for this ecosystem.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon. Next slide, please. I would like to highlight some aspects of testing and certification of mDL processes and solutions and how that contributes to ensuring trust in mDL. First, I would like to share how testing already has played an important role towards the development of the mDL standard, ISO IEC 1813 Part 5. Then I'll look into different stakeholders' needs for mDL assurance and provide an example of what may be covered in conformity assessment. Finally, I'd like to look at harmonization towards certification and conveying trust and present a case study. Next slide, please. Testing for mDL goes back already for more than 5 years. Around the time that I assumed the task of leading the new ISO task force for mDL standardization, I was involved in a project to add a chip to a driver's license card according to ISO 1813 parts 2 and 3, which are heavily based on the ICAO standards for biometric passport. Upon rollout, we were asked to test the idea of not only putting a chip on a driver license, but also to put a driver license on a chip. which resulted in the first prototype of a SIM card-based driver's license with Android and Windows Phone apps using NFC. In the ISO task force, the functional needs that AMVA's Joint Mobile Driving License Working Group had collected and technology concepts from industry came together and led to the first working draft of ISO 18013 Part 5. That led to another testing activity. In 2016 and 17, concepts proposed for standardization were proven in an operational proof of concept by RDW, the Netherlands DMV, and AMVA. Slide, please. Since 2018, a number of test events have been organized to vet the standards, confirm that it was feasible to implement, and to identify any ambiguity in the draft versions of the standard. Those events were coordinated by UL, endorsed by AMVA and its counterparts from Australasia and Europe, and enjoyed good participation from the ISO group, as you can see from the logos of the organizations they represent. These test events in Japan, America, and Australia have been very instrumental to continually improve the quality of the standard. Next slide, please. As we move towards implementation and rollout of mDL, let's have a look at some primary stakeholders and what their needs for mDL assurance are. Next. As issuing authorities get ready, they are confronted with many questions and quite some complexities. What do they need to address to ensure privacy and trust, and to gain driver license holders' trust? How can they obtain assurance that their mDL is secure and privacy preserving, and how to convey that such assurance? Maybe the most prominent question is that of the mDL verifier, the relying party. How can I trust the credential that is presented to me? And is that good enough for the use case for which I rely on that credential? Next slide, please. Now the question is, what needs to be addressed to ensure trust in mDL processes and solutions? Next. Issuing authorities should define policies governing security, enrollment and issuance, technology, and public key infrastructure. Also, requirements should be defined regarding vendor processes and the technology the vendors provide, especially for security, privacy, and standards conformity. These two areas were also identified as the most prominent to look at in AMVA's task force for mDL testing. Next. To ensure trust in mDL processes, the issuing authority's policies can be internally and externally reviewed, and processes, practices, and technologies used for enrollment and issuing of mDLs can be audited against these policies. Next. To ensure trust in mDL solutions, mDL and mDL reader technology implementations should be subject to standards conformity assessment, privacy assessment, and security evaluations. Next. The evidence resulting from auditing processes and testing solutions can be used to convey trust in mDL technologies between stakeholders. So, based on the result of security, privacy, and conformity assessment against the requirements defined, an issuing authority can accept the qualifying technology of a qualifying vendor for operational use in its jurisdiction. Also, trust the mDLs issued in that jurisdiction, the issuing authority's processes, which are audited against the applicable policies. Next. Take a look at some examples of what is covered in tests for standards. Used between mDLs and mDL reader and issuing authority systems. Involve standards conformity testing in the future may include tests for harmonized provisioning protocol authority systems and mDL. Next. mDL technology should also implement the security mechanisms and protocols specified in the ISO mDL standard to achieve the and interoperability. Conformity assessments should systematically check the conformity of such implementation to the standard. Next slide, please. Check states and test reports of individual vendors will work as long as the numbers are low. MDL deployment just getting started. The next question is how to harmonize trust. Issue authorities may work together to establish common policies and common sets of requirements for vendors, technologies, and services they provide. Next. Let me get back to gray boxes. Issuing authorities may work together on issuing authority policies and common sets of requirements for vendors and services they provide. Next. Of these processes and practices against these common issuing authority policies can be certified, and an issuing authority can publish its audit certificate together with the digital certificate of the issuing authority, CA, which is used to authenticate MDLs issued by that issuing authority. Next. Recognized audit much easier for by the certified issuing authority. Digital can easily be aggregated in a trusted master list of certified issuing authorities. Next. Finally, of vendors and technologies and services based on conformity assessment, privacy assessment, and security evaluation leads to recognizable trust in MDL solutions. In ISO, we're working on automated discovery mechanisms, which may include remote attestation of MDL or MID solutions on an MDL holder's device. Taking a similar approach to the trusted master list for issuing authority certificates, issuing authority may add the attestation signer certificates of certified MDL technology providers to a trusted master list they use in their enrollment, issuance, and remote management processes. Next. Now let's have a look at a case study in the state of toward the Iowa DOT an RFP with requests that need to be supported in their MDL solution. The RFP had separate lots, including one for independent. Next. The Iowa selected a vendor for the hosting and marketing their MDL solution, including MDL and MDL apps and backend systems for remote management of the mobile credentials. Next. The Iowa DOT separate entity to provide independent testing services. This included the development and execution of an overall test strategy. For the purpose of this presentation, obtaining and conveying trust in MDL technology, and that may benefit, may be fit for use or certification program. Next. These concern conformity assessment of apps, which involves performing hundreds of tests to confirm that MDL data, the functional behavior, and the security protocols conform to the latest version of the ISO 18013 Part 5 standard. Next. Another activity concerns the cybersecurity evaluation of MDL apps with the document review, a source code review, and mobile app penetration testing. An initial digital audit was performed on the administrative network. Could you go one step back? An initial digital audit was performed on the administrative network managed by the DOT's vendor, a delta assessment to assess the remediation efforts performed. Also, penetration test was performed on the backend systems of the state and of the vendor to verify that the segmentation implemented by the vendor between the Iowa DOT's internal network and their cloud environment is effective, that security configurations are effective, and that the applications hosted are reasonably secure. Those test and assurance activities are key building blocks in ensuring and conveying trust in MDL technology. Now let me end my presentation with a quote from Melissa Geluk, Director of the Iowa DOT's Motor Vehicle Division. The testing and security evaluation activities have provided real value towards the assurance that the Iowa MDL is conforming to the latest ISO standard and to confirm that appropriate security is in place both with our agency and with our vendor. This value is not only for Iowa as an individual jurisdiction, but also for other states and stakeholders in the MDL ecosystem. We encourage the adoption of an MDL assurance program as it really helps to jointly achieve the shared goal of trustable, interoperable MDL solutions. Thanks, Melissa. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and hand back to Matt Thompson.
Thanks, Arjan. So in summary, today's session really focused on three interdependent foundational pieces. First, trust and choice. Second, information integrity and confidence. And then third, consistency, security, and safety within the digital environment. On the first, trust and choice, John highlighted the privacy enhancing features that are embedded within ISO 18013 Part 5 compliant MDLs by discussing the privacy principles that are incorporated into the standard and the execution of those principles, which ensure user choice, user control, and transparency in operations. On the second point around information integrity and confidence, Ted really discussed the certainty, accuracy, and integrity of the information at proofing, assessment, and provisioning technologies, while Christopher highlighted the enhancing integrity and accuracy of the information to relying parties. On the third point around consistency, security, and safety within the digital environment, Arjan presented the approach to testing and certification of MDL processes and solutions to ensure the conformance of the hardware and software. And as highlighted with the Iowa case study for mobile driver's license, or Iowa's mobile ID as it'll be called, the certification structure exists today to ensure confidence, consistency to these principles by ensuring conformance of policies and processes from issuance to relying party transactions. And all of this really ladders back to our vision of enabling trust and choice in a modern and how we're developing the future of identity in America. So we appreciate all of you attending today and look forward to your continued engagement and participation in the working groups that are going to be highlighted in upcoming webinars. I'm going to turn it back now to Randy for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for that great summary, and thank you all to our subject matter experts today and for the excellent presentations about mobile driver's licenses. We're going to have a few minutes to take some questions from the attendees today, so if you have your questions, you can start to enter them into the box. And before we start taking those Q&As, please bring up the next slide so I can point out some additional information that's available to the audience. So first, I wanted to remind everyone that we do have a short 7-question knowledge assessment quiz that'll be available after today's webinar. You can either take a picture of this slide or do a screen capture, or just take a moment to write down the URL, and after today's webinar, you'll be able to access that link and participate in that survey. So participants in all 4 webinars and assessments will receive a certificate and discounted registration to any future Alliance paid conference or educational event. Also, attendees could wait a day or two after this webinar concludes when you're going to receive an email from us with a link to the recording of this webinar. And in that email, you'll also have a link to this online assessment. Go to the next slide, please. So here are the details about the upcoming 4th and final MDL webinar in the educational series. So the focus of this webinar is going to be the challenges to the MDL ecosystem and look at what the industry activities are coming forward to address those. That date is going to be October 28th, and the start time will be the same as today at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The speakers for that 4th webinar are going to be Arjan Geluk from UL, Lofi Jordan from AMVA, David Keltz from Get Group North America, Tom Lockwood from NextGen ID, Mindy Stevens from AMVA, and myself. And the registration link is there as well, but you'll also be receiving an email with an invitation to join that fourth webinar in the summary document you receive shortly. If we can go to the next slide, please. So there's also some additional resources that I want to point out to attendees where they can find more information about mobile driver's licenses after today's webinar. You'll be able to find the introductory mDL webinar recordings on this link, as well as the mobile driver's license and ecosystem white paper and frequently asked questions document. I mentioned before the Secure Technology Alliance Knowledge Center has a bunch of really good resources available to download, and I would point you also to AMVA's Mobile Driver's License Resources website, as well as the ISO Standards Group's draft ISO 18013-5 specifications for those of you who want to see what the underlying standards for mobile driver's licenses is all about. You can connect. You can go to mdlconnection.com website, which I pointed out earlier, which is active now and is announcing any major press releases about new states that have implemented MDL programs in the coming months. If we go to the next slide, please. So I'll leave this contact information up while we start the Q&A, and we have one question so far. I will make this open to anyone on the panel who would like to answer it. Do you foresee trajectory moving towards less dependence on verifiers, hardware, and terminals, for example, mobile as an acceptance verifying device, and also less direct link between the issuer and the verifier, such as a third-party ID wallet, for example? Who would like to take that question?
I can answer that, Randy. So yes, I think the answer to that is there will definitely be less dependencies in the future on specific hardware, terminals, et cetera, because a lot of this MDL work is being built around existing developments within the ISO standard body, which is 18013-5, which specifies the connection between the MDL holder and the verifiers. So as long as the verifier has a piece of hardware, be it a custom point of sale terminal, even a mobile device with an app or something in the future that we've not envisioned yet, like a car or a watch, if that device is able to communicate with the mobile driver's license over one of the channels that are specified in the ISO standard, and it meets all of the security and risk requirements for the parties involved in that transaction, there's no reason that it can't be used with MDLs. And that also goes, although it's a bit further in the future, with the MDL itself and how it resides on the mobile device. So as Arjan pointed out a bit, there's a second ISO standard being developed, 23220, which is going to be standardizing some of the issuance and provisioning features and requirements of the MDLs. And we can envision going forward with that standard that if issuance and provisioning is a standardized process, then much like other environments where there are standards in place for communication, such as on the internet, you could have third-party wallets or even manufacturer-provided wallets on your Apple or Samsung or Android device, which would work with any state's issuing infrastructure. And so that's very much akin to how we approach web browsing today. All the web browser manufacturers work with the internet. Once 23220 and 18013-5 are both fully in place, we could expect that all MDLs work with the ecosystem of MDL, verifier, and issuance.
Thank you, Christopher. So still waiting for any additional questions that we have, but let me post one to Matt and perhaps Arjan. Based on listening to your presentation, I wonder if you could comment on how well or effective do you see the industry aligning around a secure way for trusted state issuers to issue digital identity credentials onto a variety of mobile device platforms?
How well do we see industries aligning around
A standardized way, or
Yeah, why?
Kind of, is there a common way to do this?
I mean, again, I think that goes to the heart of why everyone's been involved with developing the ISO standard 18013.5. That's why everyone's been putting in so much time and effort into that, is so that we do have a standardized approach, so that, you know, that we don't have n number of different ways of mDLs getting onto people's devices. And the acceptance side, which is paramount here, that we're building standard ways, as Christopher was just mentioning, of reading and accepting those mDLs. So, I mean, we want to minimize, you know, to the extent possible, the number of mobile driver's licenses that are in the wild that are not compliant with the standards. And that's why, you know, certification programs like Arjan was highlighting in Iowa are foundational for all of this working. Arjan, do you want to add to that?
Maybe specifically to the aspect of the multiple platforms, the multiple operating systems, the multiple devices, maybe even multiple mDL technology providers that a single states may want to work with. So apart from the ISO 18013 Part 5 standard for mDL, there is this activity that Chris also mentioned in ISO 23220, and that is about the building blocks for identity management on mobile devices, and that includes harmonization and standardization of protocols for remote provisioning and remote management of digital credentials, including protocols for so standardized protocols for provisioning credentials. So that brings not only the interoperability between the mDL and the mDL reader, between the mDL reader and the issuing authority system, but also between the issuing authority system and a mobile app. And that is on that interface in the triangle picture that I had, the interface number 1, that is, if we get interoperability on that interface, that actually enables the use of multiple mDL solutions on multiple platforms, wallet solutions that support an interface may be provisioned with an mDL credential. So there are all kind of so that allows conformity to those standards will allow for even more flexibility and interoperability also with that. It makes the a state less dependent on a single solution provider. So if there is an issue with one mDL solution, or if there is an operator that goes out of business or changes priority, is a state of it actually provides resilience. And also it allows for consumer choice to say, okay, well, preferences, and that makes me more comfortable with vendor A, and another one as a to go with vendor B. So from that perspective, that is in the works. I think it will take a while because it has quite some complexities. It also has to do with what I alluded to, how to recognize that you are interacting with a trusted mDL solution. Can I, as a issuing authority, remotely attest or confirm that that is a qualifying mDL solution? So let me leave it with that. If there are more questions, feel free to reach out.
First question is, I'll send it out to the full team. can an mDL be used to authenticate one's social security number or some other identity attribute to an online replying party? If not, are there significant changes to an mDL needed before an mDL can be used for an online identity credential?
I'll take the first crack at that. You know, driver's license, just like a physical driver's license card itself, does not contain a social security number. You know, I wouldn't assume that a mDL would include a social security number. So I think the short answer is no. I mean, I'd separate the concept of mobile driver's licenses versus other types of mobile IDs. There's no reason the Social Security Administration could not put out their own mobile version of a Social Security card that would allow that kind of verification, but that's not something, to the best of my knowledge, that is built into driver's license, just like it's not built into a physical driver's license. As a matter of fact, I'm fairly certain it's legally prohibited in most states. However, I will say that on a real ID compliant license, there is a requirement to do a check against the Social Security Administration systems when verifying Social Security numbers.
Thanks, Ted. Question for Arjan: is the ISO standards efforts completed? And if not, what are the next steps?
The ISO standardization effort, well, is it ever completed? The standardization of the first edition of the standard is nearly finished. We're currently in a 2-week effort to resolve comments on the last voting round that allowed for technical comments on the standard. And we are very close to the finish line of having these issues resolved. It was our after that we'll have an internal review after the resolutions have been applied to the text. What we intended to do, as we did with previous drafts of the standard, to do a test event on top of the normal ISO process to actually confirm again and again and again that what we wrote down and what we standardized is feasible and can be implemented and really works, is really interoperable. So from that perspective, I'm very sorry that we are in the COVID-19 situation and that it hinders us to get together and actually put all the prototype and pre-production versions of the implementations of the standard together and try it all out. It has been an extremely collaborative activity, and the standard is 20 times more precise and accurate than it would have been if we had not engaged in that kind of activity. Still, we have this last round to complete. We do consider doing an alternative to a test event or have 2 test events very close to each other late October, after which any issues identified should be processed, but definitely before the end of the year is the intention to launch the version for a final yes/no vote. So in that, once that is out, that's what the world is going to say yes or no to, and that should lead to publication of the international standard by the end of the publication then will de facto take place early next year. But that is what we have ahead for the first edition of the standard. At the same time, we are working on activities to harmonize functions to facilitate these online scenarios or scenarios in which we can further improve privacy. The whole standardization activity has been a constant review on, are we indeed practicing privacy by design, security by design. Here we are looking at, currently we rely on transferring the face image of the holder to confirm that that person is really the person that person claims to be. What we are working on is standardizing on-device holder verification, enabling in-person interactions without the need to sharing your face image, and also to enable strong holder verification for online situation. And that is something we have deliberately chosen to put in the first edition of the standard what we can guarantee to be as trustworthy as today's physical driving license, at a level that is electronically protected at the same level of a biometric passport. So from that perspective, with that in the back of our minds, we have made sure that promise for the first edition. We're now working on the second edition to further bring this into the digital domain as a universal and interoperable credential for offline and online scenarios.
Great. Thank you, Arjan. Next question is for John, and maybe Matt, you could chime in on this as well. You talked about user agreements are often coercive, and end users typically don't understand the legalized language that goes with them. Do you foresee any structure for user terms changing with regard to mobile driver's licenses?
Well, you got another hour. So it's true that depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the context of the transaction, consent is not appropriate. So in the narrow case of the actual creation of the driver's license and you're pulled over by an officer of the law and you're asked to present your driver's license because there's a traffic violation, there's no consent, there's no agreement. It's built into the jurisdiction. On the other end is the use case where people talk about presenting it on entry to a bar to verify that you're of legal drinking age in the agreement. Again, with data minimization and no retention of data, and you simply send the flag back, I'm 19 or 21 or 18 or whatever the age is, and all that the doorman sees at the club is the green line. Consent is relatively low and there's not a lot of agreement. So in between those, or on the other end of those, are the things where you want to use the mDL as an in a context where you're applying for a loan or doing something that's more fraud. And then on a case-by-case, context-by-context basis, you have to look at what's the nature of the agreement. Is consent appropriate? Is it legitimate interest if we're using GDPR or some other element? It's what the mDL brings is verifiable identity with a level of authority that depends upon the issuing authority and the relying party's dependence on that relying authority. Those frame the discussion about how consent or data sharing is negotiated. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for that.
Great. Thank you, John. Matt, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I don't. I think calling it coercive is a little bit more aggressive than I was intending. But at the end of the day, I do think we can do a better job of simplifying and clarifying what data needs to be shared, is being shared, and what's being done with it, and kind of humanize the way that we present that data so that people can make better decisions about what they're sharing and how it's being used. Today, having it buried in, a EULA is probably not the easiest to use or digest way of doing it. So I just think we can do better in an mDL context than we do today. That was my main point.
Yeah, thank you, folks. I see that we are at the top of the hour here, so I want to thank all of our presenters and the people behind the scenes in the Identity Council who helped put together today's webinar. make sure you mark your calendars for October 28th for the fourth and final webinar in this series. You can send individual questions to the contacts on the webinar team if you did not get your questions answered. And reminder that today's recording, our webinar has been recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has been concluded. So if you have any colleagues that you feel would benefit from the information that was shared today, I would encourage you to share that link to others so that they could also register and be able to listen back to the session. This concludes today's webinar. I want to thank you all and have a great day.